Lewis, you are first up today.
Thank you, Carrie. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to meet you all, albeit virtually, and welcome to the open day session. And I'm about to tell you a little bit about my research, how I've employed biosocial methods and theories in my work, and what I contribute also to the Biosocial Medical Anthropology program at UCL. So first of all, a little bit about who I am. I'm a lecturer here in the department at UCL. I'm in the social anthropology section, but I guess I'm also an environmental anthropologist in the sense that I do a sort of social anthropological approach to human environmental relationships. And I teach across various modules and courses, both undergraduate and postgraduate. And my own ethnographic research, my own first-hand research, is primarily being conducted in Amazonia and the Caribbean. So that's my regional area of specialism. Probably like a lot of us here today, I have quite diverse research interests, but briefly they would be indigenous ecological knowledge and practice. So broadly speaking, that's what most of my research has been focused on. And within that, I'm particularly interested in shamanism, shamanic ritual, and shamanic healing. The indigenous communities that I work with in northern Amazonia have what we might call a shamanic cosmology, where the shaman is the main figure in society who is tasked with healing and other kinds of cosmological practices. But there's also a more political dimension to my work as well, in particular in relation to indigenous rights and the politics of conservation and sustainable development in Amazonia. Now, in terms of biosocial approaches, I'm not a medical anthropologist, but I certainly do employ inherently biosocial approaches in my own work. Broadly speaking, I'm interested in human, non-human engagements, and I work in rainforests at the very top of the Amazon rainforest, which is the most biodiverse place on Earth. So the communities that I work with, who are Makushi communities, have a very intimate relationship with all sorts of non-human beings that live in the rainforest, animals, plants, and others. And those are the kinds of interactions that I'm interested in exploring and investigating. And so in recent years, there's been a sort of new, quite trendy approach which has emerged in anthropology and cognate disciplines like geography and philosophy, called multi-species ethnography, which is trying to do ethnographic research across species boundaries, so to incorporate non-human beings into anthropological analysis in different ways. And the reason why this has emerged in recent years is because it's become apparent that we've now moved into this new geological time period, which has been called the Anthropocene. Okay? And the Anthropocene is characterized by widespread human impacts on the planetary ecosystem and climate. So in that sense, it really no longer makes any sense to make a categorical distinction between the biological on the one hand and the social or sociological on the other. And so this more holistic approach, where we're trying to look at the deep-seated entanglements of biological and social, is really at the very core of my work in advancing a multi-species anthropology for the Anthropocene. Now, in terms of the Biosocial Medical Anthropology course, which is a really wonderful program, I've been teaching on the core course for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's been a real pleasure. And what I contribute to that course is, well, first of all, this year I did a lecture on exactly what I just mentioned, multi-species ethnography in the Anthropocene, which is a really great session. And in previous years, I've also taught on shamanic medicine, plant medicine in indigenous Amazonia. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not a medical anthropologist, but I guess technically I'd be called an ethnobotanist. And ethnobotany is kind of the, broadly speaking, the study of people-plant relationships in different cultural contexts. But there's a lot of crossover between ethnobotany and medical anthropology, of course, because, you know, so much medical anthropology is focused on the use of plants and healing systems, and that's kind of what I work on from a slightly different angle. Another thing I wanted to mention in terms of biosocial approaches and how I've employed them in my own work, it's not always easy to be a master of all trades, to be a biologist, a sociologist, an anthropologist, and everything else. So collaboration is a really key way that we have been advancing a biosocial anthropology. It's certainly something I've used a lot in my own work. So I'll give you a couple of examples of projects that I've been working on in recent years, where I've collaborated with biological natural scientists in various ways. One project would be, since 2016, I've been working with some colleagues in Brazil, particularly at an institution called the Goldie Museum, Museu Goldie, which is in Belém, the city on the mouth of the Amazon in Brazil. And I've been working on a project with a couple of colleagues there. One of them is a medical anthropologist and the other one is a botanist. And we've been exploring through our own comparative ethnographic research with different indigenous groups across the Amazon basin, the use of shamanic plant charms. And in order to do that, we have had to harness anthropological, philosophical, but also deeply scientific, botanical, plant scientific approaches to try and advance an anthropological understanding of the communication that transpires between people and plants through shamanic ritual, right? And this really necessitates a close attention to phytochemistry, that's plant chemicals, right? And the ways in which plant chemicals are ingested by human beings for ritual and healing purposes. So that's one project, and it's been really exciting to work with plant scientists working at the very cutting-edge frontier of, laboratory science, as well as ethnobotanists who are working on voucher specimens in herbaria at Kew and Harvard and other kinds of institutions. So it's inherently interdisciplinary, inherently collaborative, and I would say deeply biosocial. And then the next example would be a fun project that I'm working on at the moment about pet keeping practices in Amazonia. Now, many or most indigenous Amazonian peoples have very close relationships with animals in their everyday lives. The Makushi, who are the indigenous group that I work with, for instance, if you walk into anybody's house, it's a sort of multi-species menagerie of animals and humans and plants. Usually be parrots in the palm thatched roof and maybe a monkey swinging around, and it's just a deeply kind of intimate relationship that people have with animals. So on this project, I've been trying to understand the social relationships that transpire or obtain between people and animals in the domestic unit of the home in indigenous Amazonia. And again, this is something that you can't really understand if you take a classical social anthropological approach. You really need to also understand quite a lot about ethology, animal behavior, as well as a pretty deep understanding of indigenous knowledge and practices. And that last point is kind of where I wanted to end. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a political side to this research. It's not just intellectual. And I've been working with a number of indigenous scholars, experts, activists from several indigenous groups, which is the country that I mainly work in, to try and explore and further our understandings of and synthesis of scientific knowledge on the one hand and indigenous knowledge on the other, which hitherto have all too often been opposed as being like fundamentally incommensurable, but of course they're not. So in the 21st century, and this relates to indigenous rights, politics and discourse as well, I think a biosocial approach can help us advance a more sophisticated understanding of the politics of indigenous knowledge and rights. And those of you who are familiar with politics in South America at the moment will know that that's a particularly pressing or urgent issue. I mean, the obvious example would be Bolsonaro in Brazil, who has a fundamentally anti-indigenous and anti-environmental political agenda. And those two things are deeply interconnected, the environment and indigenous knowledge and rights. So I think I'll probably leave it there. And then the final thing I would say, just to mention, the Biosocial Medical Anthropology program is a really wonderful program because I think it encapsulates a lot of what I've just said, the collaboration. So the people that you're going to be hearing from today after me, we all come from different sub-disciplines of anthropology, but we've all been working together in wonderfully collaborative way, and I've learned a lot through working with them. And second, the application of biosocial medical anthropology. You know, it's not just intellectual or academic, of course. There are a plethora of career opportunities that emerge out of this kind of research. And I think in this, the so-called Anthropocene era, biosocial approaches are going to become even more important, for instance, in international or sustainable development, as well as government and policy, and of course, academia as well. So I'll leave it there, Carrie, and I'll hand back over to you. And as I said, really nice to meet everybody, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lewis. Really appreciate that. Evie, you're up next.
Hi. I'm not quite sure how to follow that. I know my stuff is much less interesting, but yeah. So my name's Evie. I took the Biosocial Medical Anthropology course, I think in its first year, in 2018-19, and after taking finishing up my sort of undergrad in sort of bio and social anthropology. And I did my dissertation on health and resilience in older lesbian, gay, and bisexual women in the UK, and used kind of a combination of interviews and a bit of quantitative analysis, trying to sort of a mixed methods kind of approach. And yeah, I really enjoyed the masters very much. And as kind of reflecting that, I am now currently on a PhD program called the SOCB program, which is based at the Institute of Epidemiology and Healthcare. And much like this master's, it's very kind of explicitly interested in applying a biosocial approach, and also a very sort of interdisciplinary approach. So a lot of the people I'm working with are epidemiologists or sort of demographers, more sort of sociologists, those kinds of people. So it's been a really interesting experience, and really kind of, yeah, and again, a very kind of similar experience to the masters. And I sort of applying the biosocial approach, I have extended my sort of master's dissertation into my PhD project. So I'm now using some very large population surveys to try and look at sort of health inequalities in sexual minorities, as I'm currently calling them, and which again is an extension of what I was doing for my master's, but really kind of trying to integrate that approach of how inequalities become sort of, you know, literally embodied, how you know, people's experiences can go on to affect their health, is sort of really where I'm trying to work. Yeah, I would seriously really recommend this program. I had an amazing time, and it's been really helpful both in sort of my current research and sort of, yeah, where I've been hoping to go. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Evie. Really appreciate it. Emily.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. Oh, actually, I can see a couple of students I know, so hi again. So if you don't know me, I'm Emily. I'm a lecturer in biological anthropology, and I work in the Evolutionary Anthropology group. So we tend to use evolutionary theory to understand contemporary human behaviour. So in terms of what I do here at UCL, I teach a couple of undergraduate courses as well as master's modules. So I teach applied evolutionary anthropology for master's, where you'll be able to take, which is essentially kind of trying to understand behaviours identified as social problems that governments or NGOs would try to tackle, approach that from a really holistic manner, which is really important. Well, that's what biosocial is all about. So kind of understanding cross-cultural differences, the functions of behaviours. So why do certain behaviours that are perceived as bad for health or other kind of, you know, for, you know, perceived as I guess, something that policymakers would want to tackle. Why do they exist in the first place? And we might approach that from an evolutionary perspective and kind of really tease the behaviours apart, try to really get to the cause of those different behaviours, and think about interventions in that context. So if we decide we want to change people's behaviours, how do we, what's the best way to go about doing that in different types of contexts? So it's a really practical course. The first half of the course is kind of trying to understand theory and different types of, I'll put quotation, social problems. And the second half of the course is really workshop based. So it's group projects. You get to design your own intervention and things like that. So that's what I teach at master's level. And of course, I supervise different master's projects as well. So broadly, my interests are around extended child rearing and public health. So like Lewis, I probably have a lot of fingers in different topics, but it kind of comes under extended child rearing and public health. So the really core ideas that I work with is how humans evolved as cooperative child rearers. So the idea is that because we have an extended childhood, but also a really extended adolescence, and on top of that, we have, as a species, we have very short interbirth intervals. So it means we can have lots of very dependent babies and infants and older children to look after. And unlike other animals, we can't look after these offspring on our own. So we've evolved this very inherently cooperative child rearing system. And I just find that really interesting because that conflicts quite a lot with current intensive child rearing norms in the West. So that's kind of where my project often kind of gets into, is how does the intensive mothering and intensive parenting narratives, like how does that actually exist? Does it conflict with our need to have extensive support, and you know how policy is shaped with assumptions around kind of mothers being sometimes the only important person for children and so on. So I'll maybe go into specific projects in a minute, but I just wanted to, because this is a session about careers, I just kind of wanted to talk about how I got to this point, in case it's interesting for you guys. So really, I kind of came to this biosocial approach methodologically when I was doing my PhD. So my PhD was on looking at a similar thing, so kind of non-maternal caregivers and children's developmental outcomes in the UK. So I used longitudinal cohort studies where other organisations follow children or mums from when they're pregnant, follow them throughout their lives, collect data on them. The sample size is really big, it's like 15,000 children, so it's really great quantitative data that's available. So I was analysing that from my PhD, and at the end of it, rather than kind of a sense of great achievement, actually I felt like I didn't know anything. I don't know how other people feel at the end of PhDs, but I saw the benefits of using that type of longitudinal data. Understanding associations between kind of caregiver behaviour and children's developmental outcomes. But I just wanted to know a lot more about the meanings of those variables that I was using, people's experience. So I needed more context to fully understand what I was finding in this data set. And I felt like that information and knowledge was lacking, and I couldn't get that from the longitudinal data set. Not saying that longitudinal data sets are useless, actually they're fantastic. It's just I felt I needed a bit more to answer the questions I wanted to answer. So once I finished my PhD, I actually went to work for a charity called the Children's Society. And there I started working on mixed methods projects on children's subjective and emotional well-being. So in that project, we would run surveys with children where they reported kind of their subjective well-being, emotional well-being, a kind of objective measures of various things, like who they were living with, and things like that. At the same time, my colleagues would do focus groups with groups of children and talk about their different experiences. Day to day, what they did at home, what kind of things they liked and disliked at school, and so on. And we kind of put all that information together to create reports for the councils on, children's subjective well-being and how things are going in their area. So if you think about it, this was an implicitly biosocial project, because we're kind of looking at these types of mental health related outcomes and really focusing on the subjective experiences of children, what's going on at school, what kind of things are happening at the home. So, really real interaction of external and internal, and trying to kind of really look at the causal pathways between those different things. And in that project, I found how useful the mixed method approach was. So, for example, we might find some association in the survey around satisfaction with school, for example, different aspects of school and children's subjective well-being. And then we could go in and talk to children about that and then find out all sorts of issues that children were experiencing. And that kind of gave us a lot more in-depth context to what we were finding in the surveys. And actually, it was much easier for the council to kind of implement change and do all sorts of different things. So that's kind of actually this non-academic research context was so important for my own experience developing as a researcher, and that's kind of how I do my project these days. So I won't go into all of them in detail, but just as an example, I run a project on extended social support around mums and infant feeding in the UK. So actually, we're kind of running data collection right now to track this during social distancing and lockdowns and stuff in the pandemic. But essentially, we know that mums need lots of support. And infancy is this period that's really interesting. And this is where I think a biosocial approach is really useful, because there's all sorts of kind of physiological change and social change that goes on at the same time. And the reason I focus on infant feeding is because it's this really, really costly behavior. So it's up to 700 calories a day to breastfeed on demand. On top of that, you're carrying babies. So it's really energetically very expensive, but also there's really high opportunity costs if you're breastfeeding, because if you're breastfeeding, you do it on demand, it means there's all sorts of things you can't do. I'm sure, I don't know if you know anyone currently breastfeeding, you just have to be there on demand. So you can't just leave your baby and do other things. So we're kind of looking at that as a very sensitive time period for support, and then kind of looking at infant feeding experiences of mums. So what we do is do surveys with mums, ask them to report their social networks and the kind of, we also ask postnatal depression questions and all these different things about their experiences of support and infant feeding, and then also we complement that with more open text data, and mums have a lot to say in the survey, so actually we get amazing rich data just from the survey, and then also doing some sort of focus groups to get a more in-depth understanding of their daily experiences. The idea, well, we've started publishing a couple of things, but the really interesting thing that we've found so far is that everyone experiences breastfeeding problems. No one tells you about it. So I think it's 99% of mums in our survey reported some sort of breastfeeding problems. So it's actually there's almost no correlation between breastfeeding problems and breastfeeding outcomes. It's just some women are able to overcome the problems, whereas some women stop earlier than they want to, which I think is interesting and actually shows how important that kind of social environment around you is, because that's one of the things whether you are able to kind of overcome breastfeeding problems. Another different project I run is around adolescent sociality across cultures. So again, coming from a biosocial perspective, it helps you kind of challenge the public health narrative around teenagers being naughty, I guess. So coming from an evolutionary perspective, adolescence is just this really interesting stage of your life where you start to invest more in something called mating effort. So you're kind of so you're investing in yourself, developing in yourself, but also investing in building relationships, expanding your social network and things like that. So we're kind of looking at how that exists in different contexts. We started off the project doing field work in England and Japan. We asked teenagers to take photos of their lives. Oh, there's a bit of feedback. There you go, it's gone. Take photos of their lives, so we get to know more about what teenagers actually do, because you can't really do like this observational method that anthropologists like to do with teenagers, because we can't follow them, unfortunately. They don't like you following them, and they change their behavior when you follow them. So we're kind of experimenting with different methods, trying to find out more about teenagers without encroaching in their lives too much. Anyway, so that's kind of a summary of all the different things that I do and, you know, how I got to where I am today. And I think the really important thing, another thing that Lewis mentioned actually, was how biosocial makes you kind of inherently interdisciplinary, and collaboration is so important. So another thing I have been doing, and it's really fun, collaborating with all sorts of different people with amazing knowledge is really fun. And one thing I've been doing actually is try to facilitate that a bit more across disciplines. So for example, you know, organizing workshops where I invited evolutionary demographers and social psychologists and epidemiologists and people who work in public health, or, you know, people who run seminars and interventions and things like that, doing all these workshops to discuss one topic, because that's what biosocial is all about, trying to understand a topic in depth, looking at all sorts of different causal pathways around certain behaviors, so that we really understand it and we can, you know, address it properly rather than from a single disciplinary manner. So that is it from me. Hope I wasn't speaking too quickly, and I'll pass it back to you, Carrie.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The next person we have talking is Catherine.
Going. Hi everyone, nice to meet you virtually. Topic of the year. So I was on the Biosocial Medical Anthropology Masters recently. I was in the 2019-2020 year, and I loved it. It was very, very useful for me. I came to it from a bit of a mixed background. So my original studies were in the art field. So I used to organize exhibitions and work with artists, and there's a lot of social theory and critical theory that informs that kind of work. I was particularly interested in anti-psychiatry movements and the philosophy surrounding that, which then led me to retrain and start working in healthcare. So I retrained as a physiotherapist, and I've been working in the NHS now for about 10 years. And my field is working with people with complex disabilities. So what started emerging along the years was that the interventions that I was providing, and that as a service we were providing, didn't work for everyone. And the success or the outcome particular therapies was very context and person specific. So a person's background, personal background, social background was really important in influencing how they would respond to specific inputs. And I wanted to find out more about how to study these phenomenons. And that's what led me to the Masters in Biosocial Medical Anthropology. And the biosocial really provides this framework for understanding health beyond the purely biological. So yes, as you see, it's a program that's full of really interesting people from very different backgrounds that really opens your mind and allows you to question aspects of health in a different way. So what am I doing now? Like Evie, I'm on the PhD program, the SOCB program, which is a biosocial research funded program. I also keep on with my work in the NHS. I'm at the moment working in clinical research, and I find that the Masters has helped me a lot in my ability of working in this context as well. As Emily mentioned, as you'll see also perhaps with Alex's talk in a moment, there is a lot of mixed methods approaches that are being discussed in the Masters, and this influences my work in the NHS. It's also led me to run a seminar, so a series of workshops at Goldsmiths College, which was where I did my original art training years ago. And I've been working with some of the students on the idea of biosocial rehabilitation, particularly thinking through COVID-19, which is ultimately the biosocial topic of the year. And for the rest of the time working on my PhD, I'm working in particular on ideas around social predictors of menopause symptoms. And yeah, that's me. Back to Carrie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Our last panelist is Alex.
Hello. Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I have the worst problem than Emily in the sense that when I get excited about things, I speak quickly. So I will definitely try and slow down, but do someone wave if I'm going too fast. And actually, I'm really excited about biosocial. And I think probably the way I differ to some of the people who've spoken beforehand is that I'm very definitely a biosocial immigrant, rather than having originally kind of come down the line, which was a natural fit. So I started off in veterinary clinical practice with a background actually in medical physics and bioengineering, then came into anthropology and development actually through UCL. And now I teach across a range of courses with Lewis actually on environment, anthropology and development, or AED, sorry, the way around, which is a master's course which tends to look at the kind of interactions between the environment, development goals, aims, and actually indigenous within community, with development within communities rather than as a whole. And I think some of those themes have definitely informed my kind of biosocial teaching. So the thing that I probably people remember most, be it Catherine definitely, are around things like One Health, so which is the intersections between human, animal, environmental health in different ways and different outcomes. And the way I actually came into biosocial overall was that as a practitioner, very much noticed that the human worlds and animal worlds are not so different, as Lewis very eloquently put, that the blending of the two, these aren't discrete categorizations, and the health of one is the health of the other intrinsically. My PhD actually in my field area is sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly nomadic and pastoralist groups. And just as an illustration, the groups I work with have over 100 ways of lending a camel. So social ways of interacting within animals are deeply rooted in what it means to be, in this case, Gabra. And the same thing actually I found about disease. Going in there as a vet, looking at how zoonotic disease, that's disease transfer between animals and humans, could be understood. Well, actually, a lot of pastoralists don't believe there to be zoonotic disease. If your animal is sick and you're not, how could you possibly have the two? So these relationships actually have very significant and very real health implications, and the cross between the two is really fascinating to me. And that really pushed me to move beyond the clinical and actually into trying to explore this social world. And actually, biosocial is a perfect home for that. I mean, understanding how these elements fit together and how everyone's interactions between different parts of these systems are actually mutually supportive and detrimental in different ways. I actually deal specifically now in my research with kind of risk, uncertainty, and actually some of the politics around health and society. So my field area and research interests right now are looking at forced displacement, so particularly refugee camps. And I'm sure you're aware that refugee camps were usually designed for 6 to 12 months of immediate support for people, but actually been going for about 25 years. And there's these very unique areas which are forced right to the extent of state control. States almost wash their hands of these areas. So you have unique political and social environments where many cultures and communities are coming together. They're also officially not allowed to house animals, which means animals tend to go under the radar, as does plant-based resource use, as does health monitoring. So all these things kind of combine to drive really interesting outcomes and relationships between society, health, communities, and cultures. And that one of the classic examples of that is actually COVID. I mean, there's a lot of debate and argument around, people have heard the phrase wet markets before. Now, I'd suggest that, if you'll pardon the phrase, wet markets are something of a red herring. But actually, what we might need to think about is how people are forced into contact with animal populations and disease populations where they haven't been before, and how they negotiate those new relationships. And actually, my work on that has led me to be seconded into the Cabinet Office at the moment. So I actually time at UCL and 50% time in the Cabinet Office on the COVID task force. And what we look at typically are interactions around the world and plans around the world, so how different governments are engaging with this complexity. And the really nice thing, and the thing I definitely suggest you take home from this presentation overall, is that the government really values understanding how society and health and the natural world or other environments actually do interact. It's a really complex topic, but there is increasing recognition that it's absolutely fundamental to know what's going on there, or at least to have a more robust and rigorous way of engaging with it, which we haven't done in the past, actually. So this is really an emerging field, and if you're at all interested, I would definitely explore it further. It's been of immense value to me to move again, to bring in the social and the political into the medical, shall we say. What I'm actually doing at the moment is I talk to a range of groups. So I work, for example, with highly quantitative epidemiological departments and try and bring social and cultural aspects into them. And similarly, I try and support colleagues who have very, very social, cultural interests in, for example, nomadic groups, to think about how the biological world can be addressed in their work as well. So it's a really exciting place to be.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to all of our panelists. Your work is fascinating, and you've done such a great job showing how a biosocial approach can speak to some of the most pressing problems that we have today. Now I want to open up the webinar to questions from our attendees. So if any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask any one of our panelists or about the program in general, please do raise your hand or type your question into the chat. Sarah.
Great, thank you, Carrie. And I just want to say as well that this has just been such a fantastic set of presentations. Thank you, everybody. I think you've really demonstrated the vitality and importance of a biosocial approach. So thank you for those presentations. So my first question is really for, I guess, Catherine and Evie, really, to ask you a little bit about what you think the particular skills that the MSc in Biosocial Medical Anthropology has provided you with, and how you think they'll be particularly helpful in your planned future careers as well. So some reflections on the programme.
Evie, you jump in, but I'll give it a go because I have strong feelings about it. So what I found particularly useful in the Biosocial Medical Anthropology program. On one hand, it provided anthropology research method skills, which was something I didn't have at all. Interviewing skills, focus group skills. There were a lot of practical sessions that really built up not just the knowledge, but the practice of these techniques, which are definitely useful, and I've used them in qualitative work in the NHS and other things. And the other thing that was particularly useful for me was the statistics module that I did with Alex, and we used R, which is a very well regarded open source statistical programming platform, and that's also something that is very useful in my day-to-day work and in my work in PhD. So that combination of qualitative and quantitative methods was what I was looking for and what I needed, and that was set within the theoretical context of different biosocial frameworks in some of the more theoretical, in more of the theoretical modules. So those are the things that were particularly useful for me. Don't know what Evie thought.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Yeah, the methodological kind of and statistical skills have all been extremely useful. I mean, particularly the statistics, that's something that I wasn't really very familiar with, and it's something I'm doing every day now. So that was a really helpful kind of skill to be learning. But also, I think one of the big things for me was, I think we talked a lot about the kind of the interdisciplinary kind of aspect, but particularly that kind of bridging the gap, I guess, I don't want to emphasize it too much, but between sort of quantitative, hard science kind of concepts and kind of more like social theory and humanities kind of approaches. I think gulf can feel quite big sometimes, particularly in terms of like what information is deemed important or valid. So I think particularly that experience of seeing people apply that in their own work, having a chance to try and apply it myself, has been a really sort of valuable experience that I'm definitely bringing into what I'm doing now, in hopefully in a big way.
Great, thanks, Catherine and Evie. We've got a question. Do you have professors who focus on alternative Indigenous traditional medicine and who work in the healthcare fields? Sarah, you might be able to talk about Joe's research. That might be relevant. He works on this, teaches on this course. I don't know who else might be able to speak to this as well. And maybe Emily first.
I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone, but so Denise, who teaches the Evolutionary Medicine module. So one of her research topics right now is looking at the cultural transmission of what does she use? Plant use, I think, medicinal plant use. Who does she work with? I don't know if anyone remembers. I think that Benjeli, maybe she works with. I'm guessing a nod. It's not my research, so it's really difficult to communicate. But I guess one thing I'd point out as well is that when students come and do their projects at UCL Anthropology, you don't have to necessarily kind of stick to the topics of the supervisors, right? So just as an example, last year for the Biosocial Medical Anthropology, I supervised a project on menarche as a indicator of health, and kind of, so that's not necessarily what I work on, but the important thing, I think, is kind of approaching a topic from a biosocial perspective, and that's a process. So we support you in the process and teach you how to go about that process, which is the skill that you're going to gain from the masters, which then you can kind of go on to apply in different areas, which just Catherine and Evie talked about. Anyway, I'll pass it on to someone else. I think Alex just raised his hand.
Sorry, I didn't want to actually cut into Sarah, who may have something far more important to say. But it was actually more so, there's an interesting phrase there, the healthcare field. And I know that working with American colleagues, their understanding of what a healthcare field or a healthcare professional is actually very different to, for example, the UK or Northern Europe. And actually, it's very possible that you'll end up working on health and using alternative, traditional, whatever else it might, whichever denomination of medicine you want to be thinking about, and health at either a public or individual level, without necessarily being a healthcare professional. So it might be worth clarifying if S is willing to repost maybe a bit more detail about what they actually mean, as in do you have medically qualified doctors talking about alternative medicine, is very different to can we think about Indigenous knowledge and social health, both of which are very, very important. And I'd agree with Emily that biosocial is more about equipping you with the tool set to engage this really complex topic than it is about answering a specific question about one domain.
Maybe I can just add to those very, very useful comments that, and just to pick up Carrie's point as well, that we have another member of our team who does teach on the Biosocial Medical Anthropology programme as well, Joe Calabrese, who is himself a healthcare practitioner, but also works among the Navajo and also in Bhutan. So in that very specific kind of combination of anthropology and healthcare practice, then we do have members of our team. But I think Alex's point about the wider parameters of a healthcare field, I think all medical anthropologists are engaging with that in different sorts of ways as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Emily. We've got another question. What kind of careers does biosocial anthropology prepare you well for?
I wonder, can I add something to that before, just to kind of maybe precipitate further thinking? I thought it was really interesting, perhaps this is one for Emily, Alex and Lewis as well, but thinking about this current moment, COVID, climate change, real global healthcare challenges, are there new careers that we don't yet really know about, maybe, where a biosocial approach is going to be really vital? I think Alex kind of touched a little bit on that. But I just wondered whether there's any reflections people have about new careers that are emerging now, really, that haven't yet sort of become very well known or people aren't aware of.
I will add to that. Can you just give me a minute, if that's all right, so someone else says first?
Well, maybe if I can just quickly add, Sarah, in relation to careers, I think, in my kind of subfield, and as Alex mentioned, we work together as well on the Anthropology Environment and Development programme. A lot of the concerns of that master's are also very continuous with the biosocial medical one, certainly in terms of the professional application. And the area that I've been most involved with professionally would be policy and practice relating to sustainability and also to conservation. And of course, these are themes which in the Anthropocene are very integral to health, okay? But, we have students coming through the department who end up working for DFID, the UK's International Development Governmental Branch. We have students who end up working for NGOs, whether that's to do with health or to do with conservation or to do with development. We also have students who go into other arms of the civil service as well. It's just really diverse. But I think, in answer to your question, Sarah, sustainability, for better or worse, has become one of the central buzzwords in the world of development and governmental discourse today. And it's only going to become more important, as I mentioned earlier, and I think Alex also mentioned, these kinds of themes with which biosocial medical anthropology is directly grappling have been emerging in recent years and decades, but they're sort of rising in importance exponentially. And I think the next 10, 15, 20 years, certainly sustainable development, some of you might be aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a global UN initiative through which most development interventions are channeled now. I mean, the original idea was to eradicate poverty by 2030. I mean, I don't think we're by any metric on course for that, but I think the realization now is that that goal to eradicate poverty cross-culturally across the planet is completely continuous with environmental sustainability. So these are themes, certainly in my own branch of biosocial anthropology, which are only going to become more and more important. And I think that will generate a lot of new career pathways as well, you know, both in terms of policy and practice, vis-a-vis development, but also governmental engagement with it, third sector NGOs as well. So just to add that, yeah.
I mean, sorry if I can come in, if that's all right. I think if we're talking about careers and the kind of value that biosocial can add, I mean, literally from my own experience, I think Catherine, it's lovely to hear you talk about the quant side of things, but I think it is this balance between the two. In the last 6 months, some of the things I've done, I've spoken to NGOs about the use of drilling water wells in sub-Saharan deserts, and what happens is that socially you end up having nomadic groups clustering on one, which denudes the environment further and causes problems. So that was an NGO, a water NGO, that really valued this intersection between biological and social. I've spoken to the Ministry of Defence, the UK Ministry of Defence, around polio vaccinations and the fact that the American CIA used a hepatitis B vaccination program to gather information on bin Laden, which means that polio vaccinators are now being beheaded, and therefore we have a rise in wild type polio going on in northern Afghanistan. I've spoken to a company that makes haptic feedback. So this is for surgeons who can feel the response of surgery tools in a virtual environment. So surgeons from New York could operate on patients in London remotely, doing things like appendectomy. So how do you learn that biological feedback and that tacit understanding of skills? And I think what Paulina has put there in the quote is absolutely right. Is how do you bring together these disciplines? So I mean, I was going to type, and it's rather flippant that I think it's easier to list those disciplines which biosocial doesn't allow you to talk to. But for me, you can talk about across policy, across practice, across industry, all of these things. You have very real and very important things to say, and it's only going to get more so. I completely agree with Lewis on that basis. But yeah, I'm happy to talk to you. I do regularly talk to people more about this, so I'm sure all of the people who've spoken today would be willing to have a chat about what they do. But yeah, sorry, just as an illustration.
All right, well, we are nearing the end of our webinar. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Your contributions have been excellent today. And thank you also to our attendees who've come today to learn about our program. We hope that you can see how useful we think this biosocial approach is and how relevant it is now and will be in the future for all sorts of emergent careers. Please do feel free to get in touch with me and Sarah, and I think many of the people here today who have presented would also be happy to hear from you. This recording will be put up on the webpage soon. Thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate it.